Hi, this is Henry Sanders of Mass 365. Thank you again for our new season for Real Talk. And we decided to jump right into a really real timely issue. But first, I want to thank our sponsor at Park Bank. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for always sponsoring this Real Talk show and letting us make sure that we can be authentic. And I really appreciate Park Bank for understanding how communities of color deserve to have authentic voices. So thank you so much. So first, I have this wonderful panel here, as you can see, and we're always just so honored and blessed to have such wonderful, talented people in our community. And I would say that if you look at the talent in our community compared to other communities, our talent is just absolutely outstanding, the talent we have in this area. But so we are going to talk about gun violence today and all the things that kind of goes around it. Like, I know there's a lot of you out there going to like, I know I'm not going to get to some of your questions that you want. It's just a part of a conversation to start the conversation, but I hope you can learn something from today. So first, Ali, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, y'all. I'm Ali Muldrow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the co-executive director of the Gay Straight Alliance for Safe Schools of Wisconsin. I am also currently the Madison Metropolitan School District's Board of Education president. Henry, I'm so grateful to get to be here with Madison 365. I'm so appreciative of the work you all do and the way you tell the story of this community. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. And I'm excited to talk about safety.
I have to say this. I love that you talk about the Gay Safe Alliance, then you're talking about the school board. You're like doing both of those. That's like, I mean, you gotta, that's like really impressive, right? I mean, you have to.
I'm a busy lady and a very lucky person. I'm very grateful to work in this community. Yes, and a mother of three.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for joining us. Well, what about you, Chief Barnes?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Henry, for having me again. I think this is my third invite, so I certainly appreciate that. My name is Shon Barnes. I'm the Chief of Police for the Madison Police Department. I'm the 30th Chief of Police. I began my tenure in December of 2020. We've been working really hard to create a police department that we think will be the national model for exceptional policing throughout our country. We police not only for our community, but for our culture. We police for the culture of policing to ensure that if we do things right, maybe we'll set an example for other people to follow. I'm very excited about the work that we've been doing in our police department. I think we have a very safe city. Certainly, we have some room to grow, as most cities do, but I do think that we're off to a great start here in 2022, and we look to continue that throughout the rest of the year.
Thank you, Chief. I love anytime you say Madison national model, brother. I like that. I love that. So I appreciate everything you're doing, Chief Barnes. So thank you for joining us again. The third time you said it. So we'll hope you keep coming back to us. Corey, why don't we start going with you? And I know Corey from church. I know Corey from he's a neighborhood police officer. I mean, I know Corey. I know his family, good brother. So Corey, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Madison 365, for inviting me. My name is Corey Saffold. I am the Director of Crisis Management, Safety, and Security for the Verona Area School District, where I implement emergency preparedness and make sure our students and staff are safe overall. Prior to this, I was a Madison police officer for a little over 10 years, where I worked in the school as a school resource officer, which is where I learned all the emergency preparedness protocols, and I trained with the Alice Foundation out in Texas to develop the skill set before coming here. Just recently, I was on the Board of Regents, where I served as a regent, developing and implementing policy for the thousands of students in the UW system, where I served as the chair for the Capital Budget Planning Committee, as well as the Student Disciplinary Committee. So that was a great experience where I really focused on creating access to education. I'm the owner and operator of CS Consulting, where I advise local businesses and private schools on emergency preparedness, particularly around active shootings. And I'm just very excited to be here and excited to share in this conversation with everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Corey. And Pardeep, my friend, my brother, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Henry. And it's great to be on with everyone today and have this very timely discussion around gun reform, gun responsibility. I am with the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. We bring together people of diverse faiths. And part of my past, I'm also a police officer as well. So I see we got a lot of former cops on here. So the work that I do is to make sure that communities can practice their their faith, be themselves, and be safe. My father was one of the people who was killed during the Sikh temple shooting in August of 2012. So I also do a lot of work within what's called targeted violence, and whether somebody's targeted because of their skin complexion, their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, all of these different things. I think that we can agree that reasonable gun reform could keep people safer. So it's great to have this discussion today.
Pardeep, I did not know you were an ex-police officer, so I did not know that. So
No.
that's good to know. But for audience, hope you see that this panel is absolutely fabulous on this conversation. So let's start high level, if we will, then let's kind of dig down if we can. So the first question is, gun violence is a policy problem, a legislative problem, and a culture problem. Is there one of these areas that should take priority? And why don't we start with you, Pardeep?
Sure. I think for right now, I think policy really has to take priority. We need to be able to put policies forward that keep people just, again, like safer. And these policies do work. I do a lot of what's called de-radicalization therapy, meaning that I get people who may identify as white supremacists, militia, sovereign citizens, Muslim-inspired Islamist sort of groups. The world would call them, obviously domestic or foreign terrorists, but these are still people who I try to get them and try to have them live a more peaceful type of life. A lot of times when we get a call, we have to assess how dangerous that person is in the immediate moment. We had a call, and I won't give away a lot of the details of this call because it's confidential, but this was on the East Coast where airport laws were in place. And this particular person had six firearms and between 500 to 1,000 rounds of ammunition. This person was already institutionalized. This person identified in a militia group. This person was very, very violent towards himself and his parents. Parents were able to get a no contact order. And the next step was to making sure that society was also safe. So with that said, most reasonable people who are doing this work understand ERPO laws do work, which are commonly known as red flag laws. And this particular person, his 6 firearms and his 500 to 1,000 rounds of ammunition was confiscated for a year. Now that person can go back and once they're stabilized, can petition to get that back. But then it's a procedure. And this procedure needs to happen not just because you deem somebody is dangerous, but this procedure could happen whenever there's a firearm sale, a transfer, anybody who is exchanging anything of this magnitude, that can happen on the front end as well. So I think policy really has to be priority right
now. Ali, what do you think? Is it policy? Is it culture? Where do you stand on that?
So I'll say as a policymaker that I do think that, we have to talk about policy. And I think part of that is what are the vehicles that we have for people to turn in a gun, to have systems that buy guns back, that get guns proactively off the street. And then also, how do we legislate regulations that are common sense in terms of guns? And we've seen those be effective around the world. When mass shootings have happened, instead of making kids practice active shooter drills, folks have said, we need to restrict the kinds of guns that folks can have and the capacity of the guns that folks can have. And I think that's something we have to do. I do want to touch on the cultural part of this, because this is not, gun violence is not a natural disaster. It's not a hurricane. It's not unavoidable. This is a manufactured problem. And the cultural aspect that I think we have to start talking about is that we have put profit before people when it comes to guns and when it comes to gun safety. And we have to address that there are people who are more invested in selling guns than they are in the safety of our greater community. And our current laws benefit those people. They benefit the folks who are getting rich, while folks are afraid to send their kids to school. And so I think that we have to start having a conversation about who is making guns, who is selling guns, who is benefiting from the lack of regulation that we have about guns, and what we as a community can do to hold those folks accountable and to recognize why so many of our leaders, of our legislators are in the pockets of the NRA, are in the pockets of folks who lobby in the interests of selling guns and ammunition. And so I think, I really appreciate this question, because I think it allows for us to have a real conversation about the many factors. But I think the solution in the United States is very similar to the solution that we've seen all across the world, which is that you have to have common sense gun regulation that takes into consideration factors that may make it unsafe for an individual to own a gun. In the same way that we, license people to drive a car, in the same way we license people to go fishing, I think having basic standards and requirements around what it means to own a weapon capable of harming a large group of people very rapidly is something that we have to move towards, and we have to do that now.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because if you listen to the NRA folks, you listen to them, the guns are really not the issue. It's the people using the guns are the issue. And I think, again, I'm not an NRA person. I'm just, so I'm just going by what I hear from them saying, is that they see it more of as a culture issue, as I feel like they're like a culture.
So that's
issue.
But that's like if I had a restaurant and everybody was getting food poisoning at my restaurant. I said, the problem's not the food. The problem is the people eating it. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay. All right. Chief Barnes, why don't we go with you? What do you think about the culture, legislative? How do you see this?
Sure. I see it just a little bit differently in that, yes, we do have a gun violence problem in America, but we have two gun violence problems. We have the problem of mass shootings, and we have the problem of what we call interpersonal violence, street shootings, or what have you. I think when it comes to the issue of mass shootings, I think that's a legislative and a policy issue. I do not think that it makes sense not to have any common sense gun legislation around who can go in and pick up or purchase ammunition and a weapon, number one, that is intended for combat. And I've been very clear about that. I spoke about that after the last mass shooting that we had in our country. But to me, that's one of the greater issues, is that the mass shootings are normally carried out with long rifles. So the Small Arms Survey, which is a think tank out of Switzerland, estimates that there are about 100 million handguns in America and about another 200 million long rifles. So those long rifles and assault rifles that are being used to carry out mass shootings. So if we want to look at how to prevent mass shootings, we have to look at what does common sense gun legislation looks like. Does it look like someone who's having issues, or someone who was arrested for domestic violence, or someone who has mental health challenges, or someone who is 16 years old, barely old enough to drive? Should they have the capacity to commit a type of mass shooting? And if it's something that we can do to prevent that, I think we owe it to our country to take a look at that. The other thing is the issue of street shootings. And the issue of street shootings is also more of well, we tried to legislate that with handgun laws where you can carry, open carry, things of that nature. Now, the conservative approach is stand your ground, give everybody a gun, be able to fire back. And we know that that doesn't work. The same thing for the liberal approach, which is take guns away. The problem is, in this country, what we're not factoring in is that we have a tremendous black market of handguns here in America. And we forget about that. So not everyone who's engaged in a street shooting is going to a local gun store, getting a permit to go out and fire that weapon. So from that standpoint, we need better policy around storage of handguns, around where you keep these handguns, around handgun safety, so that they do not end up in the wrong hands. And we need to make sure that those persons who are known to carry weapons, those persons who are infecting communities, specifically communities like the ones that I grew up with weapons, that those persons are held accountable and that they are certainly meet their day in court to explain why they're bringing guns into our communities, no matter who they may be. So America has two gun problems. We've got the gun problem of mass violence, which I think can be solved with some legislative agenda, a better legislative agenda. And then we have the problem of street shootings, which we really have to tackle the large amount of black market guns that are on the streets right now.
So Chief, I was watching an interview on a different network, and the congressman, there was a congressman who was pro NRA, and what you just said came up about military type of weapons and the type of assault weapons that people were using. His comeback was, well, wait a minute, the weapons that these people are using are not military weapons. They're not the weapons that these soldiers would actually use in war. They're not the ones that he was a trained military guy, and he said those are not the weapons that they would use in war. Now I think he might say they're kind of assault weapons where you can use them. I know nothing about guns, right? But he said they are assault weapons that you can use, but they're not military weapons. So people need to stop saying that. So, but you're saying, I think what I hear you saying is they're weapons that the average person doesn't need to go hunting or to defend themselves. These are more weapons that can do more damage. Is that what you're saying? When you say long,
I'm saying that whoever that congressman is, he is, as we say in the South, whistling Dixie in the pines. And what that simply means is he's just talking to hear himself talk. Because here's the thing, I was in the Marine Corps, I was in the military, my brother was as well, we're both police officers. I know the difference between a rifle that's used for hunting and an assault weapon. When you have the capacity to do that much damage in that amount of time, what are you hunting? What are you hunting that's going to come at you in that volume? And so I disagree with him on that. The rounds are the same. The capacity to go from semi-automatic to automatic may be a little bit different from what we carry in the military, but they are military assault style weapons. And I think he's just playing with words there, and he should not do that.
Right. And then the second part you said about the gun violence in the streets and the black market and people being able to get guns other ways in the community. I think that's true. I think if you're someone who's a criminal, you care less about background checks and all that stuff. But I'm assuming, again, I don't know the data behind this, so you probably know this better than I do. I'm assuming some people who commit crimes are people who do get background checks, or like from a domestic violence perspective. I'm assuming that there are some people who are not getting these guns from the black market, who are going through the process that we have now and are killing people, right? Like, what would you do for those folks to catch them, right? So like, I'm outside the black market, like the people who are actually going this, are there some things we can do to flag those people who have domestic violence backgrounds, or just something who are actually have to be committing those crimes, who potentially could be committing crimes?
Yeah, so I mean, that question, if you have the legal right to carry one, you're asking how do you predict whether they're going to use that for something good or something evil? And the question is, you can't. But this is what we do know from research. The biggest predictor of violence is what? A preceding case of violence. And so when you have been involved in something violent or something traumatic, the chances that you will perpetrate violence are there. And so in your example, if someone is involved in domestic abuse and they are the abuser, that is a preceding case of violence. What do you think comes next? We know this from research. It will be future violence if there is no intervention. And so from that standpoint, the policy or legislative change will be to make sure that there is some intervention before this person is either released back or is integrated back into their family. Because there's no intervention there, then you will have that transmission of violence. The biggest predictor of violence is a preceding case of violence. This is true.
Thank you for that, Chief. Corey, what about you? And I want to come back to this culture question with you too, Corey, because I know you were a police officer and I know you're in the community. And I can hear my conservative friends say culture, the stereotypical things. Look, what about Chicago? What about Milwaukee? They're all black on black crime. I can hear all those things right now. I can hear all those people saying those things. But what about you, Corey? Do you see this as a policy issue or a legislative issue?
I kind of see it as a two-pronged approach or effect. I do agree with everything that was stated around policy and legislation, which because that's the real change that you need to prevent like those common sense laws that everyone discussed. I do see a culture as part of the problem, and it may depend on which culture you're talking about. But when you have a culture that pushes a lot of misinformation and a culture that's based in fear, now what is everybody afraid of? Why is there such this fear of one's civil liberties or a loss of liberties or basically getting your guns taken away? Like, where does that fear come from, and what is that fear embedded in, and how then does that fear drive the amount of misinformation that the policymakers and people in legislation then get? That's why I believe that culture does play a part, because culture drives policy. If you have a lot of people that are living in fear, they're going to vote how they want to vote, and they're going to lobby how they want to lobby, and they're going to prevent a lot of those common sense laws that we all are discussing that we need in place, like being at least 21. And we know that there's a significant difference in the maturity of our teenagers in the development of their brain in terms of their impulsivity, their decision making. 1 year is a huge difference. I'm working in the schools for a period of time. I see it every day. A freshman is a complete and 90-day difference from a sophomore. So the same thing is true for an 18-year-old to a 21-year-old. That's not a hard law to put in place. Like, many states already have that in place, but it's not hard to put that in place, and it doesn't affect many current gun owners. So why is there this difficulty with pushing that? Because a part of it is this fear and this misinformation, where people believe if one law is passed, there will be a domino effect that would affect them, and then their rights would be taken away. And so they fight so hard, tooth and nail, to prevent even those simple things like Pardeep talked about and the chief talked about. Those red flag laws are easy for domestics. Those are easy things to put in place that we should have put in place. So why is it so difficulty? It's fear. It's fear that then leads to misinformation that then plagues the culture, that then drives policy. So it has to come from both ends.
That's good. Ali, you were shaking your head like I love your facial expression. Did you want to say anything in here, Ali? Any of this?
No, I just really appreciate kind of emphasizing, the development of young people and what is developmentally appropriate for young people. And so if we can't trust you to go into a bar and buy a beer, it's crazy to me that we can trust you with an Uzi, right? Like, that we can trust you with some kind of machine gun. And so, Corey, I have to say, I really appreciate that perspective. And I also want to say, I think, what Chief Barnes, what he spoke to, I think is really interesting, because when you say we've got these two gun violence issues, right? One is, street violence, and one is mass shootings. I think we forget that the most common way someone will be killed with a gun is suicide. And I think that might be missed by law enforcement because there's nobody to arrest, right? But that is the most likely person who will get killed with your gun is you. And so that's a crisis that we have to talk about. We also have to talk about the role that guns play in domestic violence. Domestic violence is the most common type of violence we have in our community. And guns, escalate domestic violence frequently to a place of being deadly. And so I think, I think it's important to talk about, street violence. I think it's important to talk about mass shootings, but I also think we have to talk about the most common types of gun violence, which are domestic violence and suicide.
Yeah, that's true. I think Wisconsin, 71% of them were suicides. But I want to come back to that because I think that's important. Chief Barnes, looks like you want to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I don't think police missed that at all. For someone who's been in the military, and understanding the projects that we have around military suicides and police officer suicides. When I got here in 2020, at the end of the year, we came off a tough year. We had an officer who did commit suicide earlier that year. So I don't think police missed that because there's no one to arrest. we definitely don't miss that because we have to deal with the victims. We have to respond to the scene, make the notification. And as someone who has gone to those calls before and having to notify family members and walk through the crime scenes, they are absolutely horrific. But I do think that does bear mentioning. However, we try to look at those persons as victims and not as someone to arrest. We don't exist, at least no police department I've ever been involved in, we don't exist to count number of people that we arrest. We exist to help families and help families find closure. So I want to make sure I'm clear on what I do.
Chief, there are a lot of people who disagree with you on what you just said, but I'm glad to hear you say that. So I have a question for you that's kind of outside because I'm listening to you, and I'm always want to make sure that the listeners who disagree with us have a voice. I want to make sure all the people of color are not monolithic, right? So I want to make sure people understand that. Okay, lay this out for you. And I this is not my personal opinion, so I want to make sure I make this out. Okay, so we hear about defund the police. And then you hear about defund the police and, you hear about that. We see crimes going up. But then you're talking about making laws that you want to take away my guns to protect myself. So can it be both ways? You want to defund the police. You want to minimize, you don't want to increase police budgets. You want to minimize what they can do. But then I can't defend myself. Then you want to take my guns? That's counterintuitive. There's no way that's going to happen. That's counterintuitive. Why would I do that? The people are going to keep us safe by the police, and you want to take away their power. You don't want to give them the money that they feel they need, and you want to take away my guns. Why would I do that? Instead of you want to do more red. You want to make it harder for me to get my guns. You want to make it stricter when the violence is going up. If there was my kids in that school, I would defend myself. So how would you guys answer people like that? Like there's an average. I can hear the average person saying that when they're hearing these conversations. Pardeep, we want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, no, thank you, Henry. I think that's a great question for people to kind of ponder and ask and think about what kind of society they want to ultimately see. They want to see one where we're militarized. We're arming teachers, we're arming everyone to the point that now we feel safe because we're all armed or we all have guns. And I think for those people to kind of reassure them that you're trying to also create a safer society and also allow them to have their firearms. Now, with reform and the way that society looks as it's going forward, when we think about when the Second Amendment was adopted, and be true to the history of this country, it was adopted during a time when the First Amendment, a piece of mail took a month to get across state lines. A musket took, nearly 20 seconds to load, and it barely fired accurately. Fast forward to today, and you do have weapons of mass destruction, and you have communication of mass destruction. And whether it's mass shootings or interpersonal violence, as she pointed out, a lot of what we're seeing is this rejectionist society and feeding more rejection. And then thinking that the only way to protect yourself against that is to be armed more than the next person. That doesn't always equal safety. That doesn't always, you may make you feel better, but and so I think there's a component that's missing. It's yes, it is a policy issue. Yes, it is a cultural issue, but it's also a psychological issue that we have in this country. And the psychology is really around, what does power look like? What does fear feel like? And people can say, well, from the beginning of this country, we've had these firearms to protect ourselves against whatever foreign invasion that we thought, so that we can have a sovereign country. Well, at some point, it changed to a tool of intimidation. And we have to be honest with that. And when it changed to a tool of intimidation, it doesn't matter now what people are equating the gun to, whether those people are saying it is to power. I have power, and I need to have power, and I need to maintain power. And we're just compensating, but really power, and now maybe speaking from a faith place, power does not come from a gun. Power does not come from having more than somebody else or getting over somebody else or rejecting somebody else. It comes from a deeper place. And power comes from vulnerability. And as we go forward, hopefully our society can be vulnerable enough to say, we need to create a safer society, not just for these folks over here, but these folks over here too, and these folks over here too. And once we have a safer world for all of them, then our children can really be walking in their faiths. Then our children can really be living in the essence of what they were meant to live in. But until then, we're just going to be militarizing ourselves. And I think for those people, lots of times those people would call themselves people of faith, people who believe in God, and to really ask them, do you really? Or does your power come from a different place? And are you worshiping this gun?
That was deep. That was deep. I wish we had more time, so I would dig into that a little bit more too. But Corey, Ali, Chief, because this is a tough question, right? But this is a question that the average person I can see asking this question.
I'll jump in there, and I think a good example of what Pardeep is talking about is what we look at now with road rage, right? Road rage is no longer, you flip somebody off or yell at them. Now you're dealing with road rage. Somebody's pointing a gun at you. Right now, we're in a society where everybody has guns. I tell people that I work with or train, like, everybody has guns. It doesn't matter that you have a gun. It only made everything worse. But to get to the question of defunding the police and what that looks like and what that means for an increase in guns, I always tell people, and a lot of people are not going to like my answer, right? But it's that type of question where it may be unintentionally create some division. But I always tell people that defunding the police, because the whole argument of defunding the police started around police brutality, right? It came from the George Floyd, the Ahmaud Arbery, and not Ahmaud Arbery, but the George Floyd and the other cases of police brutality. And so people will always say, let's defund the police and then we won't have that problem. Well, defunding the police will not stop police brutality, because police brutality is a police culture problem for that particular department. If you have a police department that has issues of police department, it's the culture of that department that needs to change. You can remove all the funding from that department you want to. You're only going to have officers that have less money still committing police brutality, but you have to literally break down the culture of that department, whether that be bringing in new leadership, whether that be a process that I call where you hire over a period of time officers that think very differently. People who don't want to be police officers they usually make good police officers, right? Where you just change the culture over a period of time. So I don't believe in the idea of defunding the police, even if at face value that means removing funds, or even in the point of reallocating funds, because the original intent that the people who started using that language was to stop police brutality. My reason is that will not stop police brutality. That department has to deal with a cultural issue, a cultural plague within that department.
Got it. So you see it more when people think that you're saying it's more dealing with the police internally. But thank you for Corey. I love this. So Ali just chomping a bit. I can see Chief Barnes on this one too. I'm gonna ask the question again for our listeners. If you're telling me you want to defund the police, which to me means that you want to make me less safe. You don't want to give police more resources in an environment, a culture that's becoming more violent, but yet you want to take away my guns from me protecting myself. That makes no sense. That doesn't make sense to me as a person who believes in guns. Ali, want to answer that question?
Yeah, so I'm going to start the answer to this question by saying I'm unarmed. I've never had a gun. I've never owned a gun in my entire life. I have no interest in owning a gun. And I think the idea of defunding the police is really a prison abolitionist movement, right? It's not just about the police. It's also about the fact that we spend more on incarceration in the state of Wisconsin than we do on anything else. The Department of Corrections has the largest budget. And so I don't love the slogan, defund the police. I do love the slogan, fund education, not incarceration. The safest neighborhoods in America, the safest places in the world, they are not the places with the most police. They are the places with the greatest opportunities, right? So we want to invest strategically in safety. It means we want to invest in education. We want to invest in healthcare. We want to invest in systems that enrich people's lives. Everybody knows that a cage is not the answer when they make a mistake. And we can't have a conversation about incarceration. We can't have a conversation about policing. We can't have a conversation about safety in the United States of America without talking about racism. And so the reason we removed police from schools was not because we wanted to defund police officers. The reason we removed police officers from schools was because they had a track record over the course of almost 2 decades of arresting majority Black children every single year. The last year that we had police in schools in Madison Metropolitan School District, 80% of the students that were arrested at schools by those officers were African American. So school-based policing was producing racist results. The other thing is that I heard somebody describe, gun control or common sense gun laws as the liberal approach to this problem. That's not the liberal approach to this problem. That is the global approach to this problem. Nations around the world have recognized that you need gun safety, you need common sense gun laws in order to address the public safety issue that is mass shootings. And what country after country has been able to do is pass those laws, is restrict the kinds of guns people have, and they've seen incredible results. On average, we see a mass shooting in America, or a school shooting specifically, about once a month. Nowhere else in the developed world do you see that. And so I think, we really have to start having a conversation about what actually promotes safety. And we spend a ton of money on policing. We spend a ton of money on incarceration in this country. And it has never produced safety for all citizens. And in fact, it has driven up a very racist reality in terms of who's incarcerated, who's policed, who's ticketed, who lives under constant surveillance within our communities.
Yeah, I think I read that there was 27 school shootings this year alone. So, Chief Barnes, Ali brings us some really good issues and points here about SROs. I wanted to get to that later, but first I want you to hit on the question about defunding the police. I'm really curious about your answer about this. A person says, hey, and then I want to dive into the SROs. So I think that is a really relevant question. And I think a logical question, I think a fair question to ask about SROs in school, especially with the shootings. How do we bridge that gap? But Chief, first the defund the police and taking away my guns argument.
Yeah, I think I'm more in line with Ali than maybe a lot of people would suggest. I am a big proponent of education. I will tell anybody that. I started my career as a public high school teacher. So I am a big proponent of education. In my own personal experience, it was education that failed me, not the police. It was what happened or didn't happen in our schools and how they treated us. The disparities that I saw in the classroom. And so I am certainly a big proponent of moving more money towards education and making sure that our kids are well educated so that they can become very productive citizens, no matter what path they may choose, whatever field of endeavor they may want to be in. That's kind of how I see the defund the police. I really don't think that people want the police to go away. I really don't think that's the case. There are some that want the police to be abolished, but for the most part, what they're asking for is equity. What I will tell people is when you close your eyes and you think about what a safe neighborhood looks like, you think about hearing the birds chirp, and you think about cars and people walking their dogs, what do you see and what don't you see? The one thing you won't see in that vision in your mind are police cars patrolling. And so, yes, we want to get to a point where if we have safe neighborhoods, safe schools, it means that the police are not there. And so in order to get there, how do we get there? We have to get there by using sound evidence-based policing practices, using problem-oriented policing, and using community policing. We're not there, but I think that there is a path forward. I'm always hopeful that that's going to be the case. As a law enforcement leader, as the law enforcement leader in the city of Madison, I see myself and my department as part of the solution and not part of the problem. If there are things that we're doing that we can address, then I'm willing to have those conversations, unlike a lot of chiefs around the country who quite frankly deny that anything is wrong and kind of keep moving forward and ignore people. I'm not going to do that because I know better. And if that means that I'll have to have some tough conversations, then so be it. Now, to the issue of if we defund the police, we take guns away from people. I'm not suggesting that, because we do have a Second Amendment. And so obviously, if we remember civics class, we have a Second Amendment, which is different than what we have in other countries. It's very difficult to generalize what happens in other countries unless you can say we have the same set of circumstances. And so we have this robust Second Amendment that many people think it's absolute, which I don't agree with that. But what I'm suggesting is that we have responsible gun ownership. And that is important. That means that we make sure that we don't have a black market, that we make sure that people whose brains aren't fully developed cannot get assault weapons, that there's training and things of that nature. I think it makes a lot of sense to do that. And we're not asking to take away anyone's freedom, because my role, my responsibility as chief of police is to protect the constitutional rights of people. That's what my job is. And in doing so, that may be those that I don't agree with, but with good legislation, I think we can certainly work to ensure that we have responsible gun ownership.
It's interesting you talking about the brain development. From the studies I've seen, the brain developments don't really get to the 25, 26. So, I mean, that is a fascinating conversation about where you go with that conversation. So when you go to 25, you can't drink till 25. 20, I mean, that's a deeper conversation. At least from the studies I've seen, that's where the brains of our youth are really fully developed, 25, 26 years of age.
Let me jump in there. I think the chief made a great point that, at least in my setting and working with a school, has to be brought out more in that responsible gun ownership. Because when I study these after action reports, in particular, Sandy Hook, the Oxford, Michigan shooting, right? Those are individuals that got their guns from the home. So when we think about responsible gun ownership and how we can prevent, particularly these active shootings, these mass shootings, a lot of that occurs, from really the home and parents who either believe that they know their child well or don't have their guns secure. So there are some very simple steps that we can take. Lock up your guns. A lot about, I would say, studies show that about 300 or so unintended shootings involving children per year, according to the New England Report of Medicine, involved children at home where the guns were not secured and were not locked up, and about 146 of those amounted in a death. So there are things that we can do when the chief mentioned responsible gun ownership to prevent a lot of these shootings. And one of the simplest things that we can do is start at our own home and keep our guns locked up.
I love that. It's a great tangible action that I think hopefully all sides can agree to that, right? I hope. You never know today's culture, but hopefully everyone can agree to that. But since we're talking about,
I just want to add something to the brain development part of it.
Yeah.
What we're seeing, a lot of these high profile sort of incidents that have happened in Buffalo and Texas, Sandy Hook, the Newtowns, and even as we think about brain development of a child that isn't diagnosed with autism, we're seeing a lot of people who are on the spectrum, or diagnosed or undiagnosed, and so their brain development is not. It's different. It's just they're wired differently, and this is not to stigmatize people within the spectrum related disorders, but a lot of times those types of people have an increased obsessiveness with power, with other things, and sometimes they falsely equate that to the firearm, and so they have an obsessive mentality around that. And lots of times, because they're sometimes socially awkward, that comes back to, like, I don't feel so powerful in school. I didn't feel so powerful at elementary school. at middle school or other places where they see other people who have power, they want to enact that. So that's oftentimes why those places are the places that are targeted. This is happening over and over again, but to kind of think about brain development of the normal sort of whatever that child would be to adulthood. But these types of cases are also unique in different ways.
Okay, that's fascinating to me. Okay, just for the sake of time, I'm going to try to ask a couple more questions here, and then I know I want to let you all go. But we're talking about guns in schools, and I think we have to address that, right? Especially the shooting in Texas. The police sound like they're outside for like an hour while this was going on. Basic question for me, a layman guy who doesn't know much about, schools, guns, but like you are much more educated and fluent on these things than I am. But a basic question I would ask, if this was Madison, I would say, well, Madison does not have SROs in the schools. Does that make schools a soft target? Does that make schools somewhere easier not having those SROs in schools? So if there was an SRO in the schools, does that make it more, are the schools safer from mass shootings from someone coming from the outside? I'm not talking about, Ali, what you addressed about, the more Black kids getting arrested over time, which is a deeper conversation. But would that make the school safer to say, okay, we had SROs in the schools, someone trying to come in from outside to shoot up the schools? Would the schools be safer from that perspective? Who wants to answer this one? Ali or Chief, I want to start with one of you two. That'll come to you, Corey. I see you.
Sure, I'll start with that. It's very hard to make a prediction about how people are going to behave. When I was in SRO, we had a gentleman, a student who wrote out a plan to shoot up the school. And in his notebook, the first thing he was going to do was to shoot me in the morning. And so, we were tipped off about it. We interceded at his home, recovered the weapon, recovered his notebook, which is why I'm able to tell you that. So I was at Grimsley High School, one of the biggest high schools in Greensboro. About 20 years prior, they had a principal who was shot and killed by a student. And the SRO, at the time, they did not have an SRO. It's interesting that you asked that question because, it's almost like a trap door. You just don't know. But what I will tell you from my experience as a certified SRO and my experience in the military, it's that outer perimeter that's the most important. It's ensuring that, you have doors that are closed, that you can't open from the outside without getting buzzed in or without having some legal business there in the school. It's about having the relationships built in, like I had at Grimsley, where a student could call me in the middle of the night and say, hey, you should look at this. Someone just posted something on Facebook, or you should look at this. It's about having those relationships to prevent it at first. We do have active shooter protocols. And I will tell you, without giving out too much tactics, is that when there is an active shooter, police officers, they have one role, and that is to stop that active threat. And so if officers are standing outside waiting to go in, waiting for SWAT teams, if they are trying to get their own children out, none of that is anything I've ever read in any police training that says it's proper protocol. After Columbine, we went through national training about how to intercede when there's an active shooter threat in the school. And so it's just, if what you're saying is true, it's certainly not within standard, and I think they should be held accountable if that's the case. However, to answer your question, I think the SROs certainly add an additional level of security against active shooter threats.
Ali, I'll come back to you, Corey, because I know this is what your expertise in management and security. I'll come to you also, Pardeep. But I'm curious, Ali, because you are on the school board. I just heard your perspective on SROs and the impact it has on Black youth in our schools. So how do you balance that out?
I really appreciate this question, and I really appreciate what Chief Barnes just spoke to, but I do want to say there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that SROs prevent school shootings. There just isn't. And I wish there was. I also want to acknowledge that Madison has 53 schools and sites, and we removed officers from 4 schools. So we've never had police in schools. We've never had police in our elementary schools, right? And that was what was recently targeted. And then I think we can't have this conversation a week and one day after 19 babies died. 19 babies. These are people's children, and 2 educators and 17 other kids were hurt, and not be honest about how desperate people are to feel like their kids are safe at school, to feel like their kids are safe in this world. And so I do understand that if people have a degree of security related to police being at school, that it makes sense, right? Like I'm not a person who can be callous towards that, but I will say there just is a lack of evidence. School shootings have continued to happen with regularity at schools where officers are present. And we know that, right? And so just having an officer there, just having a police car parked outside has not prevented people from walking into schools and killing kids. We saw that at Parkland. We've seen all kinds of safety measures, right? When you talk about Sandy Hook, they had when I was a kid, the big thing to do to prevent school shootings was to lock all the doors and to put an intercom on the door to make sure nobody could get in. You know what? Sandy Hook had every single door locked. They did not buzz the shooter in. He shot through the door. He walked into the school and killed a bunch of elementary school children, right? So I think we have to start being honest about why we have this problem and why we don't see this problem in nations around the world. Nations around the world do not put police officers in their schools. They legislate the types of guns citizens can have, and they do things that proactively prevent mass shootings from happening. And we have to take responsibility and do the same thing here because it's proven to work around the world.
And Ali, would you say though that culturally the United States has a culturally more guns are part of the culture of the country?
Hey, I mean, this is Wisconsin, right? We have a hunting culture in Wisconsin. And so I'm not saying we're going to ban every single gun, but several people, I think where all of us have agreed is you don't need an AR-15 to kill a deer. Right. So I'm not saying that we're going to completely, get rid of guns. I think on average in Canada, there's about 5 guns per household. They have a hunting culture too. They just don't have the types of guns that we do. Right. And so I think talking about, regulating magazines, talking about regulating ammunition, talking about regulating the capacity of damage a gun can do is something we have to do specific to our country because that's specific to our culture. But I hear what you're saying in terms of, we have a gun culture and
I would argue that we have and I might get in trouble with this, but I think we have more of a machismo, violent, strong culture. Like I think we have a very independent culture. Like you're not going to tell me what to do and I will defend myself. I think that makes the United States very unique from the rest of the world from that culture perspective. I think
you can look at places, in South America where gun violence is really common. I think you can look at, I don't think we are uniquely positioned in terms of having sexism or having men who engage in violence or those things. I do think, just saying like this is part of our culture doesn't excuse it, right? Just saying we have a rape culture doesn't mean we shouldn't do things to address sexual assault and sexual violence. Just saying that we are a country that has a relationship to racism from infancy and that racism is part of our culture doesn't mean we shouldn't do things to address the disproportionate arrests of kids of color, right? And so I think we absolutely have to address we have to take responsibility for our culture and we have to step in and do things about it. And I think, as much as I understand people being comforted by the presence of police officers, I think that's very much dependent on the kinds of relationships you've had with a police officer, right? If a kid looks like George Floyd and he walks into his school and he has seared into his mind an image of police officers standing around while a man is suffocated for 10 minutes. That doesn't make that kid feel safe, right? And so, I understand some people associate police officers with safety, and I understand that some people associate police officers with oppression and pain and police brutality. And I think we have to balance the perception and the reality.
Yeah, I love what you just said about, because we were saying safety. How do you define safety, and who's safe? And I was asked a question more from you were talking about how the world, how they do. I'm like, I just think we're so unique in your country, but I got your point. Corey, you want to jump in on this too? This is about SROs in schools, and is it safer? How do you see that playing out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting and tough question. I think, like the chief said, there's no way to really measure that. There's no way to, predict how effective an SRO can be at preventing such school violence. But what can be measured is the everyday effect that police being in schools may have, which is some of the things that Ali pointed out. What I can say in my profession in keeping the Verona School District safe and keeping other businesses and other school districts safe is that there are tools, very practical and tangible tools that we can use to keep everyone safe. And for an example, one of those greatest tools is what's called a threat assessment or violent risk assessment. And when we get these reports, however they come in, they can come in through the community members, through students, through the police. When we get these reports, we sit down a group of professionals immediately that includes law enforcement, and we just assess, does this person pose a risk? And if this person poses a risk, what is the safety plan that we're going to put in place to prevent said risk? And what are the resources we are going to give that person so that years down the line, they won't pose a risk to another school? We have implemented this process for since I've been in existence here, and it is very effective. And we start at the elementary school level. I mean, it's done at every level. Another very powerful tool is giving students a voice. Chief Barnes mentioned those relationships. So my school district has staff and security assistants that do very well at building a rapport with students. And we also have a tip line so that we can give students a way to report information and remain anonymous. That's huge, because most of the information that has come in that caused us to do a threat assessment, a violent risk assessment, whatever you call it, has come from our tip line and has come from students. Students want to report this information. Students see and know everything, and they want to be able to share it. So it's very important that we give them an outlet to share that, where they can remain anonymous and not feel like they're snitching on their fellow classmates or anything like that. Just not too long ago in Waukesha South High School outside of Milwaukee, a student saw a gun, reported that to the school SRO. The school SRO intervened and was able to remove that gun from the school. Right here in Verona Area School District, right, one of our own security assistants noticed something that was off. Why? Because of the relationship they have with that student, because of the very close ties they have with their students. They noticed something that was just quite not right and off about that student, reported their concern to me, and I removed the gun off of that student. Now, he didn't bring that to school as a threat to the whole school community. He was feeling fearful of something that was going on near his home, near his own community, and wanted it on his way home. So I want to put that out there, that we didn't have a threat technically here. But the point of that is the relationship, the powerful relationship that our security assistant had with that student to be able to recognize that. So when you combine threat assessments with a tip line, with strong relationships in the schools, those are far more effective than metal detectors or all of these things. They're just, from my experience, are very, very effective. And then you add the hardening of the school, secured entrances, doors are locked, security presence. But really, it's that threat assessment process, that preventative measure that really prevents violence from, in this type of way, from coming into the school.
Pardeep, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think just, Corey, I think relationships, communication. I think thinking about people and really it's, I thought about this question for a very long time and continued. I think this needs further research in this. There is somewhat of an impossibility of predicting prevention and saying, well, what child at home thought about the SRO and said, hey, well, I'm not going to shoot up the school today because I know there's an armed person who's going to, and vice versa. I've heard of our anecdotal stories of, we've had a 15-year-old kid who that was part of his mindset. Let me kill the SRO first and then go after the rest of the people. So there is somewhat of that. There is truth to that, to say the SRO does stand in between, at least in the mindset of somebody that's at home and saying, I'm going to plan to shoot up the school tomorrow. And I think that thinking about SROs and they're not a monolith. There's some good SROs. There's some horrible SROs. There's some who can navigate a school culture, and there's some who can't. I think that, for everyone else, I think that's also, I think as it goes forward, ultimately we're going to have to decide what it is that we want. What kind of culture do we want as we move forward 5, 10, 20 years from now? Do we want a culture that's going to be a bit more about security or about learning, about nurturing, and not to say that you have to have one or the other, but I think those are questions that are weighing on people's hearts and minds right now. So I think this is a great discussion of this is wonderful how we are able to communicate and but I think having people, like Corey pointed out, be able to communicate well. If you see something, say something. Best yet, say it when the person's still at home, hasn't done anything. Then when the person enters the perimeter, get that done. If the person enters the school, right, it's a little bit at that time it's too late. And as Ali pointed out, it's difficult when there's a will, there's a way, and that the Sandy Hook shooter definitely had a will, and he was going to get in. But that's the level of hatred that he had directed towards his upbringing when he was in that grade, and the sting of bullying that he felt that went unprocessed. So I think all of these are great discussions to have as it goes forward.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up because we've been out here for an hour already, and this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Ali, I want to bring you back, though, to have a conversation and maybe change it up, because I really think the domestic violence part and the suicide part is really relevant to gun violence. We don't talk about that enough. And you look at the numbers are like, they are what they are. Like, you can't argue with the numbers. And so I really wanted to have a conversation about that. So maybe I'll make this a series just to talk more about gun violence. I just think it's there's so much you all said that I really want to dig into. And Chief Barnes, I really want to talk to you again actually about strategy of, if I'm a parent and my kids are in the Madison School District and you're the chief of police of Madison, I want to know my kids are safe. And I want to know that my kids are safe holistically, right? I think Ali's dealing with how a student might feel with a police officer in school, etc. I think you have to address that. I think that's every day that the kids have to deal with that type of, if they're safe or not. But as the chief of police, I really want to know from you, someone who loves the city, how are my kids, one of the things that Madison's really known for is a K-12 system, right? And Madison historically is a safe city, really, compares to Milwaukee, for example, right? So we're really a safe city. But how do you get around that? I'm sorry, Pardeep. I love Milwaukee, but the numbers are the numbers, bro. I can't, So what would you say to people, and how would you help parents and families feel safe, that the schools are safe, that their kids are safe in the schools? And I really want to hear that from you as a person, a layman person looking outside in. I want to know, especially in this moment, how our kids are safe, right? So I would love to hear that from you more. And Corey, you said something to me that was fascinating, that you're saying about relationships, but all those stories that you gave were SROs, were in right? So they're all about people in the schools, right?
These are staff members. There's a security team.
Okay.
That have strong relationships, and so they're their own schools security. And my motto is prevention through relationships. And so And I do want to add, I know we're short on time, but that there's a whole list of other preventative measures that I do deploy at the school district to prevent things, everything from having the police go to the house if a person posed with a gun on the internet, a lot of different things that we do. I'm just a big proponent of the threat assessments, the vital risk assessments and relationships.
Okay. And Pardeep, you talked a lot about power. And how do you help the youth feel empowered? So those people you're talking about who might isolate themselves, if it's not a gun, they might, my thing is if even if they don't have a gun, they might lash out other ways, right? So how do you intervene before they feel like that's the outlet? So I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like we'd have a deeper conversation because you all said such wonderful stuff that all deserve more time to really flush out. So I might bring you all back at this different series on this. So anyways, thank you for your time, Chief Barnes, for everything. And thank you. I want to say this from a man who grew up here and knowing the different chiefs of police. You are probably one of the ones who are the most outgoing, who is willing to actually speak your truth. So I appreciate that about you. I really do. Agree or disagree with you. You will speak out. You will. You don't. Anytime I say I want you on the show or something, you never say no, ever, no matter what the topic is. So kudos to you, Ali. You are. You don't say it, Ali.
I'm so grateful to get to talk to you, Henry, any chance, and I so appreciate the voices that you brought to the table today. And I'm like, I think, it's great to get to have this conversation with people who think differently than me. It's great to get to have this conversation with you, Henry, but it's also great to be united as people of color talking about solutions. And so I'm so grateful for the folks who brought in best practices, who brought in relationships, who brought in the brain development of our young people, because I do think that as different as we all are, I think fundamentally, what we want is for our community to be safe and for our kids to be safe. And Madison and we have an average of 7 homicides a year in Dane County. And the majority are domestic violence. We are a safe community. We can be a safer community. And I'm grateful that I live in a place that strives to get better and better.
Yeah, great. That's all right. Great way to say that, Ali. And Pardeep, thank you for everything you're doing. And sticking with this issue. I mean, when this happened, the shooting, and you still with this. So thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for always saying yes. And Corey, brother, thank you for all the wisdom you brought, man, the tactical stuff. I appreciate all your time. And thank you, everyone, for watching another episode of Real Talk. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
This is 365 Media.